The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Laura Bennett pushed through the ICU doors at 6 in the morning, her badge clipped to the pocket of her scrubs, her posture the careful architecture of someone who'd learned to be present without being noticed. The hospital smelled like it always did, antiseptic and stale coffee, and something underneath that, something like fear that no amount of bleach could scrub away. She moved past the nurse's station without making eye contact, her shoes silent on the tile floor, past the room where Mr. Chen slept restlessly, past the bed where little Sarah had finally stabilized overnight, toward room 304 at the far end of the corridor where the sickest children lived in that terrible space between recovery and goodbye. Room 304. She knew every inch of it by now. She knew the way the morning light came through the window at exactly 6:08 a.m., painting a rectangle of pale gold across the vinyl floor. She knew the rhythm of the ventilator, the metronomic beeping of the cardiac monitor, the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through the endotracheal tube. She knew the angle of the bed where the 12-year-old boy lay motionless beneath a thermal blanket, his small frame almost swallowed by the machinery that was keeping him alive. General Marcus Hayward's son. That's what the chart said. Injured in a vehicle explosion during his father's deployment to Bagram. Traumatic brain injury. Massive blunt force trauma. The words in the file were clinical and careful, which somehow made them worse. Laura checked the 4-line running into the boy's left arm with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. The needle placement was perfect, she'd inserted it herself 2 days ago, the 22-gauge angiocath going in smooth as silk, no fumbling, no second attempts. Her hands never trembled during procedures. That was something else she'd learned a long time ago, in places she wasn't supposed to talk about, in situations that had carved away anything soft or uncertain from her fingers. She adjusted the flow rate by a fraction, watching the clear fluid descend through the chamber in its steady mechanical rhythm. The boy's arm was thin beneath her palm, the skin pale from 2 weeks of fluorescent lights and recycled air. And there, just above the foresight, faded almost to the color of his skin itself, were letters in blue ink. 4 of them. Bennett. Her name. Written in a hand that wasn't hers. She straightened the blanket. Checked the monitor readouts. Drew a breath that came out steady. That had been 2 years ago, in a field hospital in Kandahar where the walls were canvas and the lights ran on a generator that never quite stopped shaking. She'd carried him out of there, 8 miles across terrain that was trying to kill her with every step, his weight against her chest, his blood on her hands turning dark in the heat. She'd kept talking to him the whole way, not sure if he could hear her, not sure if it mattered, just knowing that if she stopped talking it would mean she'd accepted that he wouldn't survive. The medics at the forward operating base had tended his wounds while she stood outside in the Afghanistan sun, watching dust devils spiral across the desert, and then they'd shipped him stateside to his father's base in Colorado. She'd gotten on a different transport. She'd gone quiet. She'd learned to be invisible. And now here he was in room 304 at Seattle General in Denver, lying in a bed, breathing because a machine was breathing for him, and she was the person who changed his bedding and adjusted his medications and talked to him during the night shift even though he couldn't hear her. Laura moved to the window and looked out across Denver's early morning skyline. The mountains in the distance were still dark. A medical helicopter passed overhead, its rotors shaking the glass with a sound like thunder. She'd heard that sound before. She'd been inside helicopters that made exactly that sound, had felt them thrash through desert air toward forward surgical teams, toward waiting traumas, toward the desperate mathematics of triage and time. 12 years of that. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A mouth that had learned not to open, eyes that had learned to look through people instead of at them. A limp that favored her left leg on days when the pain was worse, a legacy of shrapnel that doctors said would never come out because it was too close to the femoral artery. The ICU was starting to wake up now. At 6:15, Nurse Donna arrived at the station with her coffee mug and her kind eyes. At 6:22, Dr. Patterson made his quiet rounds on the western wing, checking vitals, reviewing charts, moving through his patients with the practiced efficiency of someone who still remembered they were human beings. At 6:38, an alarm sounded in room 301 and Laura heard footsteps, heard the murmur of voices, heard the machinery adjust itself upward. The hospital's heartbeat. She knew it the way she knew the rhythm of distant mortars, the way she knew which sounds meant danger and which ones just meant it was Tuesday. She walked back to the supply cart and retrieved fresh gloves, bandages, sterile saline. The locker room was empty when she opened her locker, the small square of metal and darkness where she kept her personal items. There wasn't much. A phone charger. A hairbrush. A photo of a mountain range that could have been anywhere. And in the back, tucked behind her spare shoes, hanging on a wire hanger inside the lining of her old Special Forces unit jacket, a patch. Faded green background, the unit designation in gold thread, worn soft from decades of being pressed against soldiers' chests in places that don't show up on any map. She didn't take it out. She just stood there for a moment with her hand near it, not quite touching, the way someone might stand near a fire without needing to feel the heat. That jacket had been issued to her in 2011. She hadn't worn it since 2019. The patch was the only piece of that life she'd kept. Everything else had been burned or shredded or left in a safe deposit box in Arlington that her lawyer said would remain sealed until she was dead. Footsteps in the hallway. Polished shoes on tile floor. A sound like authority moving through space. Laura closed her locker with a quiet click and turned away, her face neutral, her breathing unchanged. The morning light was starting to break through the east-facing windows now, painting the ICU in shades of gold and gray. Down the corridor, she could hear voices starting to gather, the particular tone that meant the attending physicians were approaching. Grand rounds would start in 7 minutes. She'd checked the schedule last night. Dr. Mercer was leading today. 15 residents following behind him like satellites orbiting a star, like students of something that was supposed to matter, learning the particular language of dismissal that senior physicians used with the nurses who were actually keeping the patients alive. Laura had stood through grand rounds 100 times. She knew how to occupy a room without being seen, how to let the commentary about her work roll past like water, how to keep her expression flat and her hand steady and her thoughts completely, entirely to herself. She returned to room 30 for one more time before the rounds began. The boy was the same as he'd always been, still comatose, still ventilator-dependent, his brain swollen from the trauma, his prognosis stamped into the medical record with a finality that made her think of stamps on travel documents, officially sealing a destination you didn't choose. The chart at the foot of his bed said it all in careful clinical language. Hopeless. Vegetative. Permanent. The kind of words that created a kind of gravity, pulling everyone toward acceptance of an ending that hadn't happened yet. But when she looked at him, when she adjusted his position to prevent pressure sores, when she cleaned his mouth and checked his eyes, she saw something the chart didn't mention. She saw a 12-year-old child whose father was a 4-star general, whose father had probably built his entire career on the principle that you never abandoned your personnel, that you never gave up on your soldiers no matter what the mathematics said. She saw a boy whose arm was tattooed with her name in faded blue ink because 2 years ago, somewhere in a dust storm with mortars in the distance, she'd made him a promise. And promises, in Laura's experience, were the kind of thing you either kept or you didn't. There was no middle ground. The intercom crackled at 6:55 a.m. Grand rounds, ICU, in 5 minutes. Her hand stilled for a moment. She straightened the blanket one final time. She pressed her palm against the boy's forehead, warm, stable, the fever from yesterday finally receding. Then she stepped back into the hallway and closed the door quietly behind her, and that's when she heard the footsteps getting closer, the voices of 15 doctors gathering like a flock of birds, drawn by the scent of something to pick apart, drawn by the presence of someone who could teach them how to dismiss the unkillable hope in a room with a comatose child and a nurse with steady hands and a past that nobody knew existed. The fluorescent lights above the nursing station hummed their monotonous frequency as Laura Bennett pulled the patient chart for room 304, her movements economical, practiced, the kind of efficiency that came from years of operating in spaces where wasted motion meant wasted seconds. She documented the neurological assessments at 0600 and 1200, precise notations on pupil response, limb tone, verbal stimulation baseline. The chart grew thicker by the day because the child deserved that documentation, because invisible care was still care, because she'd made a promise 2 years ago in Kandahar that didn't have an expiration date. At 08 for 5, the hallway shifted. The temperature changed the way air pressure changes before a storm. Laura heard the footsteps first, multiple sets, a coordinated movement, voices stacked in that particular cadence of institutional authority. 15 residents in crisp white coats trailing behind Dr. Mercer like remoras following a shark, and he was already talking, his voice carrying the theatrical contempt of a man who'd never experienced genuine consequence. He held her chart elevated like Exhibit A at a trial nobody asked to attend. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when nursing staff confuse compassion with competence, Mercer announced, his tone smooth as diesel fuel. The residents orbited closer, their attention sharpening like predators sensing weakness. Nurse Bennett here has documented neurological assessments every 2 hours on a vegetative patient with a hopeless prognosis. Every 2 hours. He tapped the chart with the precision of a judge's gavel. We're looking at long-term vegetative care placement. Irreversible brainstem damage. I've already contacted the insurance company about transitional facilities. Mercer's eye swept across the gathered physicians, collecting their nods like chips from a poker pot. This represents dangerously outdated nursing practice. Heroic delusion masquerading as patient advocacy. It wastes critical resources and clouds clinical judgment. Laura stood 3 feet from the group, hands folded in front of her scrubs, her face arranged into absolute neutral, the kind of neutrality that came from holding position under mortar fire, from watching things that broke lesser people and choosing to breathe through it anyway. Her eyes fixed on a point past Mercer's shoulder, somewhere between the wall and the door, her jaw absolutely still. The mastery of composure was indistinguishable from the mastery of contempt, and Mercer had no framework for recognizing the difference. One of the residents, Jenkins, his name tag read, leaned toward his colleague with the confidence of someone who believed himself unheard. Does Captain Obvious think she's going to miracle him awake? His voice carried just loud enough to travel the 15 feet between them, the syllables designed for penetration, for damage. Mercer's expression shifted into something approximating a smile. Captain Obvious. That's exceptional, Jenkins. Make a note. Documentation. This meticulous suggests either clinical incompetence or deliberate padding of billable hours. Both are problems. He closed the chart with the finality of a coffin lid. Reassignment pending. We can't have this approach influencing the critical care protocol. The residents dispersed behind him like schools of fish changing direction at a single signal, their white coats vanishing down the corridor in synchronized retreat. Laura's jaw muscle twitched once. Not from anger. From something deeper, something that lived in the part of her that had been trained to process threat without responding to it, to observe dominance hierarchies without acknowledging them, to exist in hostile spaces and remain absolutely, utterly still. The tremor lasted 0.3 seconds. She controlled it the way she controlled her breathing, the way she controlled the 17-year chapter of her life that had ended the moment the Pentagon decided Operation Granite Shield never happened. She continued her rounds as if Mercer's words were background noise, as if the weight of 15 doctors' synchronized judgment meant no more than wind against glass. By 1400 hours, she needed coffee, and the break room vending machine was the only place on the unit where people occasionally forgot she existed. She approached the machine's illuminated face, scanning the options with the same tactical deliberation she brought to medication administration, purposeful, unhurried, her uniform still perfectly creased despite the morning's ambush. 3 other staff members occupied the break room, clustered near the sink. She registered their presence the way soldiers register potential vectors of approach, location, distance, threat assessment, and determined she could operate without intersection. Her hand was halfway to her selection when she heard the voices. Did you see Mercer absolutely destroy Captain Obvious this morning? The whisper came from 2 residents occupying the corner by the coffee maker, their laughter already building like a pressure system. I heard she might get security escorted out by Friday if she keeps that up. The other resident's impression of Laura's voice was technically accurate in tone, deferential, careful, softened by the particular deference that nurses learn to wear like protective gear around physicians. But doctor, I really think the patient showed response, his pupils dilated when I spoke to him, the mimicry dissolved into laughter, the kind of laughter that required an audience even if that audience was silent. Laura's jaw muscle twitched again. This time it wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from understanding exactly how quickly a human body could fail when the right pressure was applied to the right places, from comprehending the distance between her and each of them, from knowing without question that she could end this dynamic with a single gesture, a single word, a single move. The restraint was the muscle work of a person who'd seen what violence actually did and had chosen, quite deliberately, never to repeat it. She selected her coffee, black, no additives, nothing that would slow her response time if response became necessary. The vending machine dispensed it with a mechanical sigh. She inserted $2 bills into the slot with the same precision she'd used threading a needle, took the cup, and turned. Their laughter stopped. Not from anything she'd said. From the quality of her stillness, from the way her eyes met theirs with the casualness of someone looking at equipment instead of people, from the complete absence of emotional response that somehow communicated more violence than any threat could have. Laura walked past them toward the door. One of the residents, Jenkins, muttered something about needing to get back to rounds. The other followed quickly. The break room returned to its ambient silence. She held the coffee cup steady as she walked back to room 304, her hands not shaking because she'd trained her nervous system to understand that hands were instruments, not emotional expressive devices. The cup was still steaming when she set it on the counter in the boy's room, beside the monitors that tracked his vital signs with their persistent, patient rhythm. The child lay in the bed exactly as she'd left him, pale against white linens, his chest rising and falling in the mechanical pattern of a body still performing the basic functions of staying alive while the part of him that had memories, that had smiled, that had asked questions, remained trapped behind swelling and hemorrhage and the neurological silence that 15 doctors had declared irreversible. His arm lay across the blanket, and she could see the edge of her name tattooed there in faded ink, the letters she'd given him 2 years ago in a different country, in a different life, when carrying him 8 miles through hostile territory had seemed like the only possible choice. She lifted his arm gently, checking the foresight with a kind of attention that suggested the boy still mattered, still deserved documentation, still represented something worth fighting for even after the institution had declared him a lost cause. The fall was patent, the infusion rate stable, the fluid clear. Everything was exactly where it should have been. She set his arm back down carefully, her hand steady as surgical laser cuts, and that's when the first monitor alarm sounded, not yet, not the one that would change everything, but the beginning of the cascade that would transform this shift into the moment that everyone would eventually understand had been the real reckoning, the real test of who Laura Bennett actually was when nobody was watching and the system itself demanded her silence. But that alarm hadn't sounded yet. Right now, in this moment, she was just a nurse sitting beside a comatose child, holding a cooling cup of coffee, waiting for the institutional machinery to complete its assessment of her obsolescence. The boy's chest rose and fell. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. And in the break room 3 floors away, 2 residents were still laughing, unaware that they'd just insulted the woman who was going to teach them something about the nature of true competence, about the cost of dismissing quiet people, about what happened when you picked a fight with someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The break room at Seattle General at 11 p.m. was the kind of place where fluorescent lights cast everything in the color of surrender. Laura sat alone at a table scarred with coffee rings and ancient graffiti, her jacket spread flat before her like an artifact in a museum. The faded Special Forces unit patch, sewn inside the lining with thread that had yellowed from 15 years of sweat and desert sun, lay exposed under her steady hands. Black needlepoint embroidery on olive drab. A Spartan helmet. A lightning bolt. The words Operation Granite Shield stitched so small only someone who'd lived it would recognize the significance. She traced the embroidered insignia with one scarred finger, the kind of scar you got from shrapnel that didn't quite kill you. The Kandahar Field Hospital. September 2009. The collapse had come without warning, a 500-pound JDAM that found the eastern wall while she was stabilizing a boy with a compound femur fracture. Dust. Screaming. The weight of concrete across her legs. And then hands. His hands, impossibly strong for a 12-year-old, pulling her clear while his own father was 3,000 miles away commanding an invasion that would consume the next 4 years of his life. The boy had written her name on his own arm in permanent marker that night, a farewell gift for a soldier he thought was dying. Captain Laura Bennett. She'd kept that detail classified for 2 years. Literally classified. Her entire service record in that region had been buried so deep that even her own mother believed she'd been stationed in Germany when Operation Granite Shield went sideways and someone needed a scapegoat. The Pentagon had been explicit about the terms of her disappearance: keep working, keep your head down, never surface, or they would pin the failure on her and she would spend the next decade in appeals court or federal prison. Being a nurse had seemed like the perfect invisibility. Scrubs instead of dress uniform. A badge instead of dog tags. A 12-year-old boy in a coma, unable to recognize the woman whose name was still tattooed on his arm. She folded the patch back into her jacket lining. 2:19 a.m. The monitors in room 304 began their escalation with the subtlety of a heart attack, which was precisely what this was, except the heart wasn't failing. The lungs were collapsing. The boy's chest heaved against the ventilator in the synchronized desperation of a body suffocating from the inside. His oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor dropped like a stone through water: 94. 91, 87. 82. The swelling in his trachea, the swelling that Dr. Mercer had dismissed during rounds as managed with current protocols, had progressed from inflammation to obstruction to total airway compromise. Laura was there before the monitor alarm finished its second cycle. No running. No panic. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the precision of a woman whose hands had learned, over 1,000 emergency situations, to separate the noise from the signal. O2 sat dropping, 78 now. 60 seconds before brain death became a mathematical certainty. The boy's lips had taken on the pale purple of someone drowning in air. She moved to the supply cart with the economy of motion that came from 8 years of military trauma medicine. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand before the resident on night rotation fully woke from his station chair. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call for Dr. Mercer. This was exactly the kind of situation where procedure manuals became obstacles and chains of command became nooses. Her hands moved on their own. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical landmark burned into every Special Forces medic the way other people memorize their own address. She felt the resistance of skin, then the giving of tissue. The needle angled precisely, guided by the kind of intuition that only came from having done this on soldiers bleeding out in Helmand Province, in Kandahar, in the dust of a dozen towns whose names the American government had worked very hard to forget. Then the sound. The hiss of air escaping. A long, releasing sigh as the pressure in his chest cavity found its way out through the gauge needle, the sound of life returning to an impossible situation. The rhythm of his breathing changed instantly. The ventilator's mechanical pressure eased from desperate to sustainable. His lips shifted from purple back toward pink as oxygen began moving again instead of backing up into dead space. O2 sat, 84. 88, 91. 95. Climbing steady. 40 seconds. That was the entire window. 40 seconds between a salvageable child and a brainstem dead body that would live on machines until insurance stopped paying the bills and Dr. Mercer's transfer arrangement with Greenwood facility came into play. The resident was on his feet now, staring. Did you just call respiratory? Tell them we need emergency airway surgical kit standing by. We're moving to cricothyrotomy if this progresses. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not commanding. Just stating fact. And get Dr. Mercer on the phone. Dr. Mercer arrived at 2:17 a.m. with his hair perfectly styled and his pressed white coat still bearing the crease from the dry cleaner. He moved into room 304 with the casual authority of someone entirely certain that the universe operated according to his preferences. His eyes registered the stabilized child, the needle she'd placed, the O2 numbers now sitting solidly in the 95 to 97 range. Talk me through your decision-making, Nurse Bennett. She kept her voice level. Deferential. The mask still on. Acute airway swelling beyond ventilator tolerance. O2 sat crashed to 78 in under 90 seconds. Conventional protocols would require physician assessment before intervention, but she paused. Gave him the opening to interrupt. He didn't. But he had approximately 4 minutes before irreversible brain death. The needle decompression was the only intervention that would preserve the window for definitive airway management. Mercer nodded slowly, his fingers already pulling up the chart on the computer terminal. "And you performed this procedure without physician authorization because he would have died if I didn't. No apology. No softening. Just the statement laid down like a fact of physics." Mercer's jaw moved slightly. A small hitch in his rhythm. For just a moment, Laura saw something flicker across his face, not anger, but something older. Calculation. He was measuring her against something. Reassessing. She watched him process the gap between the timid nurse he'd humiliated during grand rounds and the person who'd just performed an emergency medical procedure with the precision of someone trained by the United States military. "I see." He made notes on his tablet with the deliberate slowness of someone documenting. Protecting himself. "We'll discuss this further in the morning." By 9 a.m., 3 formal written complaints had been filed against Laura for scope of practice violation, insubordination, and creating unnecessary liability exposure. The overnight attending had submitted the first one, or rather, Mercer had submitted it with the overnight attending signature, a detail Laura discovered when she checked the hospital system and saw the timestamp. By 10 a.m., the ICU charge nurse, a 19-year Navy veteran named Reeves who'd been present during the code and had nodded quiet approval as Laura worked, had been reassigned to orthopedic surgery. The schedule change came via email from Mercer's office, reallocation of staff resources. By 11 a.m., Laura discovered she'd been removed from all critical care rotations and placed on medical surgical overflow. She wasn't fired. Not yet. That would be too obvious. Too quick. Mercer was smarter than that. He was methodical. He was dismantling her access piece by piece. By noon, she passed Mercer's office and heard his voice through the partially closed door, "A liability we simply cannot afford, not with the transfer arrangements already in place." "Yes. The Greenwood facility. My standard referral terms are still active." A pause. "Understood. We'll move forward once this nurse situation is resolved." The words landed like shrapnel. Not shrapnel in the dramatic sense. Shrapnel in the precise medical sense, small fragments that embed themselves deeper with movement. At 4 p.m., she was called to human resources. Mercer was already seated when she arrived, his posture relaxed, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd already won. The HR director, a woman named Patricia whose name tag hung slightly askew, looked uncomfortable. "Nurse Bennett, I'm afraid we have some serious concerns," Patricia began. Mercer interrupted smoothly. "Effective immediately, your employment with Seattle General is terminated. The reasons are documented in your file: overstepping scope of practice, insubordination in the context of a direct physician assessment, and creating unacceptable liability exposure for this institution." Laura didn't blink. Didn't clench her jaw. Didn't show the tremor that lived in her chest where her heart had been before she learned to replace emotion with function. "I understand. You'll need to surrender your badge and access credentials," the HR director said quietly. "Security will escort you from the building." Laura reached up and removed her badge, the thing that had been her identity for 4 years, and placed it on the table. The plastic was warm from her body heat. She stood. She walked toward the door where security had already appeared, like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. She'd been through this before. The erasure. The disappearance. The moment when the world decided you no longer existed in any official capacity. They'd done it to her after Bagram. They'd done it to her service record. Now they were doing it to her employment history. The security guard was young, maybe 25, uncomfortable with the task. He didn't speak as he walked her to her locker. Didn't speak as she removed the jacket with the faded unit patch still sewn inside the lining. Didn't speak as she turned in her parking pass and walked into the Denver night with nothing but her wallet and the weight of knowing exactly what Dr. Mercer was. He was competent. That was what made him dangerous. By 3 a.m., Dr. Mercer had filed 3 formal complaints. The paperwork arrived in Laura's inbox like a precision strike, each one dated that morning, each one citing her a dangerous deviation from protocol during the needle decompression. The first complaint came at 6:56 a.m. The second at 7:15. The third at 7:42. He was thorough. He was systematic. He was going to bury her before the hospital cafeteria opened for breakfast. The ICU charge nurse who'd witnessed the emergency, the one who'd called for the needle, who'd seen Laura's hands move with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, was reassigned to night shift at the psychiatric ward before her morning coffee cooled. No explanation. Just a note in her personnel file that she'd requested the transfer. She hadn't. Laura found her crying in the locker room and didn't say anything because there was nothing left to say. The machine was moving. The gears were turning. And the people who'd seen the truth were being scattered like ash. By 8 a.m., the staff schedule had been rewritten. Laura's name was removed from every critical case for the next 6 weeks. They were reassigning her to post-op recovery, the patients who were already past the worst, who didn't need acute intervention, who didn't require the kind of decision-making that Laura had just demonstrated in a 40-second crisis. It was a sidetrack dressed up as reassignment. It was erasure disguised as policy. Dr. Mercer placed calls to board members at 9:15 and 9:22. Laura didn't hear the calls, but she saw the ripple. A hospital administrator she'd never met before appeared in the ICU at 9:50 a.m. and walked the hallway with Mercer, nodding at things he pointed out, the ventilator settings, the 4 lines, the way the room was arranged. The administrator's expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone being shown evidence of a problem that needed solving. A liability. That's what Mercer had called her on the phone. A liability we cannot afford. Laura heard those words later from a resident who'd overheard them in the break room. A liability. Not a nurse. Not a person. Not someone who'd just kept a child alive when 15 doctors had written him off. At noon, Mercer summoned her to his office. The door was mahogany and heavy, the kind of door that closed quietly. His desk was organized with the precision of a surgical tray, pen at 10 o'clock, legal pad at 2, his nameplate centered perfectly. He was wearing the same charcoal suit as always, his tie a deeper shade of blue today, his hair still perfect despite the chaos he'd orchestrated that morning. He didn't ask her to sit. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," he said. His voice was calm. Clinical. The way someone might explain a diagnosis they'd already decided on before you arrived. "We're citing overstepping scope of practice. Performing emergency procedures without authorization. Endangering a patient through insubordination." Laura stood in the doorway. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The tremor wasn't fear. It was rage, compressed so tightly it felt like stillness. "The patient's blood oxygen was 68, she said. Her voice came out flat, factual. Without decompression, he had for minutes before cardiac arrest. The resident on call was 2 floors away. "Protocol exists for a reason," Mercer replied. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the legal pad in front of him, as if he'd already filed her away in whatever system kept his conscience organized. "You violated it. That creates liability. Security will escort you out. Your access card will be deactivated. You're to remove your personal items from your locker immediately and leave the facility." The words came at her like a sequence, each one clicking into place, building the architecture of her disappearance. She'd been told to disappear once before. After Operation Granite Shield went sideways. After the Pentagon buried it. After they scraped her service record clean and told her that surfacing again would mean pinning the mission's failure on her, on the medical team, on anyone but the people who'd planned it. They'd given her a new name then. New Social Security. A nursing license in a state where nobody knew her. She was good at disappearing. Security appeared in the doorway as if on cue, a man in a dark uniform with the flat expression of someone paid not to think too hard about what he was doing. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Laura walked past Mercer's desk without looking at him. She went to her locker. She pulled out the faded unit patch she kept in her jacket lining, the only piece of that life she'd allowed herself, sewn so carefully into the seam that it was invisible unless you knew where to look. She'd carried it through nursing school, through 3 hospitals, through years of keeping her head down. She'd carried it like a talisman, like proof that the person she'd been still existed somewhere inside the person she'd become. The security guard waited while she changed out of her scrubs and into civilian clothes. He walked her down the hallway. Nobody looked at her. The residents she'd trained, the nurses she'd worked with, the doctors who'd ignored her, they all kept their eyes on their work. Disappearing was easy when nobody was looking in the first place. Outside, the October air hit her face like a slap. The sky was the color of wet concrete. Rain was coming. She could smell it, that metallic scent that comes before a storm, ozone and electricity mixed into the clouds. She walked to her car and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes, her hands on the steering wheel, waiting for some part of her to break. Nothing broke. Her training held. Her composure held. The mask she wore held so perfectly that she couldn't remember what the real face looked like anymore. At 3 a.m., she was sitting in an empty diner on Morrison Street, the kind of place that stayed open for insomniacs and people running from things. The fluorescent lights cast everything in shades of white and gray. A waitress with tired eyes refilled her coffee without asking and without speaking. Laura's mug had gone cold an hour ago, but the waitress refilled it anyway, coffee for a ghost, served by someone who'd learned not to ask questions. She stared at her reflection in the black window. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Tired eyes. A jawline that had lost some of its sharpness. Hands that rested on the table flat and open, palms down, as if surrender had already happened and she was just waiting to be told. Is staying invisible the same as never having existed at all? She'd saved that boy's life twice. Once in Kandahar 2 years ago, carrying him 8 miles through territory that wanted him dead. Once this morning, pushing a needle through his ribs to let his lungs breathe again. And he would never know her name. His traumatic brain injury had stolen all memory of her face. The tattoo of her call sign remained on his arm, Bennett, but the boy attached to that tattoo, the person who'd earned it in a war zone, had been erased from his mind. She'd been erased twice now. Once by the Pentagon. Once by a hospital that decided that a man with perfect hair and a referral arrangement mattered more than a nurse who kept people alive. Outside, a semi-truck passed, its headlights cutting through the dark, and for one moment her reflection vanished entirely. She was gone. The world went on without her in it. She wrapped both hands around the cold mug and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 16 hours, she let the mask slip. Just for one moment. Just in the dark. Just enough to remember what it felt like to be real. Her phone buzzed at 3:33 a.m. A text from Ethan, "Mom, where are you? Call me." She silenced it. At 4:15 a.m. the waitress brought the check. Laura left a $20 bill for an $8 meal and drove home as the sky turned the color of old bone, that gray before dawn when nothing is quite invisible and nothing is quite visible. Everything exists in a kind of suspension, waiting for the light to decide what's real. She found Ethan awake in the living room when she got home. He was 17 and furious, and he was holding her shadow box frame in both hands. "Mom, what happened?" His voice cracked on the second word. She told him. She sat on the edge of the couch and told him everything, Mercer's complaints, the schedule changes, the calls to board members, the calm surgical voice explaining her disappearance. She told him about the boy in room 304 and the tattoo on his arm and the fact that she'd saved his life and he would never remember it. Ethan's jaw set in a way that reminded her of his father. The man she'd married before the military. The man she'd divorced after coming back wrong from Kandahar. She saw that same anger in her son now, that same refusal to accept erasure. "They need to see these," Ethan said, standing. He held the shadow box up to the light coming through the window. The glass caught it and threw the medals back at her, bronze, purple, silver. She hadn't looked at them in 3 years. The Bronze Star. The Purple Heart. That silver star. They need to know who they fired. Ethan, no. She stood. Her voice shifted into something command-like without her meaning it to. I can't. I was told to disappear. If I surface, if I let people know I'm still here, they'll say I violated the order. They'll say I'm the liability Mercer claimed I was. They'll bury me deeper. Then surface, Ethan said. He was looking at her with something in his eyes that looked like recognition. Like he was seeing someone he'd always suspected was there but had never quite been allowed to meet. What are they going to do, erase you twice? She opened her mouth to tell him it was more complicated than that. That some erasures were permanent. That some disappearances couldn't be reversed. That the Pentagon didn't take well to ghosts that insisted on haunting them. But looking at her son, holding her medals like a war cry, she realized something. The mask had been perfect for 16 hours. She disappeared so completely that even she believed she was gone. Maybe it was time to come back. Ethan kicked open Seattle General's main entrance at 10:07 a.m., and the doors swung wide like wings. The shadow box, Laura's medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like mechanical wasps, was clutched in both his hands, frame tilted toward the security guard who didn't recognize what he was looking at. Didn't recognize the bronze star. Didn't recognize the silver star behind it. Didn't recognize the two purple hearts that meant his mother had bled for people she'd never met. Mom, they need to see these. Ethan's voice carried across the lobby like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He was 17 and furious and fearless in the way only teenagers could be, and no tactical awareness, no understanding of institutional power, no sense that some doors shouldn't be kicked open. He marched past the security desk toward the corridor where the boardroom door was closing. Where Dr. Mercer sat presenting his case to the hospital administrator and 3 board members. Where Laura's termination was being rubber-stamped into permanence. The security guard called after him. Ethan didn't stop. Upstairs in room 304, the boy's eyes moved beneath closed lids. For 3 days his brain had been locked inside his own skull, trapped in a darkness that stretched backward to a desert road and forward to nothing. But something was changing in his neural pathways now. The pressure in his cranium had been relieved by 47 seconds of needle decompression that Dr. Mercer would spend the rest of his career trying to erase from the record. The child's mouth moved. His throat made a sound like wind through a canyon. Angel 6. Just 2 words. Whispered in a child's voice that hadn't spoken in 72 hours. The words came out clear and steady, like a command encoded in muscle memory from a battlefield 2 years dead. General Marcus Hayward, 4-star rank and Special Forces operational background, arrived at Seattle General at 9:54 a.m. He had flown overnight from the Pentagon on a classified briefing, his dress uniform still carrying the humidity of Kandahar in its wool fibers even though he hadn't been there in 18 months. His face was carved from command and consequence. He stepped into the hallway outside room 304 to check on his son one more time before the neurosurgeon's 10:56 a.m. consultation. And he froze. The boy's eyes were open. Tracking. Focused on the ceiling with the kind of purposeful awareness that meant brain function, meant neural recovery, meant the 15 doctors who declared him hopeless had been exactly that, hopeless. Incapable of hope. Angel 6, the boy whispered again, and General Hayward's jaw went tight as piano wire. In the boardroom 1 floor below, the hospital administrator was explaining to Mercer that his employment had been terminated effective immediately, pending investigation into the complaints filed by nursing staff. Standard protocol. Regrettable. But the young woman's actions during the emergency code had been, while heroic in intention, significantly outside her scope of practice as an ICU nurse, and the liability exposure to the hospital was unacceptable. Then the doors burst open. Ethan stood in the frame, breathing hard, holding the shadow box like it was a holy thing. And right behind him, moving with the precision of someone who had studied doorways and threat assessment for 23 years, came a Marine liaison officer in dress blues. Captain James Chen, no relation to the hospital IT director, carrying a folder marked Secret Declassified. General Hayward is on his way up, Chen said flatly. The Pentagon just declassified Operation Granite Shield. We need to talk about Captain Bennett. The room went dead silent. The silence that comes not from absence of sound but from absence of breath. Dr. Mercer's face went pale. Then white. Then a shade that suggested his cardiovascular system was rerouting blood away from non-essential organs in response to perceived threat. Captain Bennett, the Marine liaison continued, served as trauma surgeon and emergency medical officer on a classified extraction operation in Helmand Province, Kandahar region, in 2022. During the operation, she maintained a trauma bay under sustained mortar fire for 9 hours and 14 minutes while evacuees were being processed through her station. Her actions were cited in a Silver Star recommendation. 3 officers recommended her for commendation. 1 senior officer recommended she be buried. He opened the folder. The citation was handwritten in military formal, every word weighted with consequence. She held that medical station alone. No support. No backup. 15 casualties processed through her hands. All stable for evacuation. All survived extraction because she wouldn't stop. Because her hands moved like she was operating in sanctuary even when the mortars were within 200 meters. Dr. Mercer's voice came out cracked. That's a blatant fabrication and I have security footage proving this woman violated protocol. I have documentation. You have video of yourself coaching 15 residents to sign a pre-written diagnosis declaring the patient's condition hopeless, Chen interrupted. His voice was calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already won. Before the patient had fully awakened. Before any neurological assessment was performed. Before any diagnostic imaging was done beyond the initial CT from his arrival. You have video of yourself on the phone with Greenwood Long-Term Care Facility negotiating referral kickbacks at 100% markup on transfer fees. You have 3 additional calls discussing inflated billing for transport services that don't exist. General Hayward's footsteps came down the hallway like the countdown to something ending. He stepped into the boardroom and took in the scene with the tactical awareness of someone who had planned 1,000-casualty evacuations. His eyes found Dr. Mercer first. Then moved to the shadow box in his son's hands. Then finally found the Marines officer. Is Captain Bennett in the building? His voice was the voice that had shaped battlefield decisions. The voice that gave orders to people who carried automatic weapons. Room 307, Chen said. Waiting to hear from her termination hearing. General Hayward looked at Dr. Mercer. You fired the woman who kept my son alive. I terminated an employee whose actions violated institutional. The general snapped to attention. His hand came up in salute, a full military salute, the kind that means respect, means rank, means witness. He held the salute toward the shadow box where Ethan stood trembling with rage and vindication. Toward the Bronze Star and the Silver Star and the 2 Purple Hearts that proved beyond institutional doubt that Captain Laura Bennett had seen the worst and chosen to give the most. You carried my son, General Hayward said, his voice breaking. 8 miles from a collapsed facility in Kandahar. Bleeding. Unconscious. You carried him 8 miles on your back through desert that wanted to kill you both. And then you walked away because someone told you to disappear. And then you showed up in a hospital in Denver and saved his life again because that's what Captain Bennett does. She saves people. And you fired her. Dr. Mercer was standing now, backing away from the general's presence like it was a physical force pushing him across the room. I was following protocol, I was managing institutional risk, I was. The boardroom door opened. The hospital IT director, Lieutenant Commander Chen, Naval Reserves, wearing a submarine service pin on his lanyard, walked in carrying a hard drive the size of a playing card. Dr. Mercer requested deletion of security footage from the 2 a.m. code in room 304, he said, his voice steady as sonar. He submitted the request at 6:03 a.m. this morning through the hospital network. I have the timestamp. I have the deletion request. And I have every frame he tried to erase. All of it. The coaching sessions with the 15 residents. The phone calls to Greenwood. The email chains about insurance fraud. He placed the hard drive on the table like it was an artifact of incalculable weight. I forwarded everything to the State Medical Board 40 minutes ago with a complete timestamp log. I also forwarded it to the FBI field office. They'll want to discuss your relationship with Greenwood Facilities' financial structure. I understand you own 6% equity in the company. Dr. Mercer's hands gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles went white. That's protected financial information. You violated my privacy. I'll sue you, I'll sue this hospital, You'll do nothing, General Haywood said quietly. Because in about 45 minutes, you're going to be in an FBI office answering questions about medical fraud and insurance conspiracy. And then you're going to spend time getting very familiar with the federal legal system. And I'm going to watch it happen because my son is awake and asking for the woman you tried to bury, and I want to know what that woman's name is so I can thank her properly. The board chair, a woman with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who had seen institutional corruption before and knew its shape, turned to Dr. Mercer. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending investigation. Security, escort Dr. Mercer from the building. 2 security officers materialized. They didn't grab him roughly. They didn't need to. They simply appeared, and Dr. Mercer understood that his presence in the hospital was now a thing that could be ended by people who had the authority to end things. He stood. He walked toward the door. As he passed Laura, who had emerged silently into the hallway, her face showing nothing, her posture unchanged, he hissed something vicious and small. You think you've won? You're still just a nurse. Laura met his eyes. Her face was calm. Her breathing steady. The kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to a person. The kind that makes tyrants feel small. She said nothing. General Haywood said it for her. She's a captain. You're a fraud. There's a difference. 6 months later, the winter had turned the grounds of Walter Reed Medical Center into something almost beautiful, frost on the grass, the chapel visible through bare trees, the kind of clean cold that meant healing. Laura stood in her Class A uniform, dress blues tailored to precision, and watched the boy, the general's son, walk across the stage of the rehabilitation center. He moved with a cane. His speech was still slow. His left side would probably always be slightly weaker than his right, neurology being what it was, trauma being what it was, brains being the fragile instruments they were. But he walked. He spoke. He remembered. The director of rehabilitation presented him with a certificate. The audience applauded. General Haywood sat front row, medals catching light. Ethan sat beside him, grinning like someone whose mother had just been proven right by the entire United States military establishment. The boy stepped to the microphone. His hand was steady. I don't remember the explosion. I don't remember most of Bagram. His voice was clear, the recovery of neural pathways that shouldn't have recovered. But I remember a voice telling me to stay awake. I remember someone carrying me when I couldn't feel my legs. I remember waking up in room 304 and seeing a face I should have known. And when the doctors said there was no hope, I remember that same person refusing to accept hopelessness. He turned toward the audience. His eyes found Laura's. Recognition was clear in them, not the shadowy recognition of neural recovery, but the actual, present-moment awareness of seeing someone and knowing them. When I woke up in that hospital, the first thing anyone told me was that my name was written on my arm. They said a nurse had written it there. They said it happened 2 years before, in another country, on a day when someone carried me 8 miles and wrote her name on my skin so if I ever woke up, I'd know who saved me. He lifted his left arm. The tattoo was visible from every seat in the auditorium, Bennett in careful block letters, the handwriting of someone writing in darkness, writing in blood, writing to mark permanence. This is Captain Laura Bennett, he said. She saved me twice. Once in Kandahar. Once in room 304. And I'm here because she wouldn't give up. He reached toward the audience and extended his hand. Laura rose. She walked to the stage with the bearing of someone accustomed to public recognition, and when she reached him, the boy gripped her hand with surprising strength, the grip of someone who had clawed his way back to consciousness, back to speech, back to the world through sheer neural determination. They stood together while the room applauded. The kind of applause that comes from witnessing something true, something that mattered, something that proved that kindness and refusal were the same thing. General Hayward presented Laura with a commendation from the Joint Chiefs. She accepted it without ceremony, without tears, without the tremor that civilians expected. She simply took it and nodded at the general, and in that nod was an entire language of military understanding: mission complete, objective achieved, personnel safely extracted. In the back row, Lieutenant Commander Chen sat with the ICU charge nurse who had testified against Dr. Mercer. She had been recruited to lead critical care at a hospital in Portland specifically because of her ethics. She had a job now where institutional corruption wasn't just tolerated but actively rooted out. She had a career because she had been willing to tell the truth. That afternoon, Laura received a text from an unknown number. It was a photograph of a community college classroom. Dr. Mercer stood at a whiteboard demonstrating CPR compressions to a handful of bored students. The caption read, "Front Range Community College, $16.50 per hour, license suspended 5 years, FBI case pending federal prosecution." Laura deleted it without responding. She didn't need revenge. She had her name back. That evening, she visited Seattle General one last time to collect her final belongings from the ICU. The director of nursing intercepted her in the hallway. "We want you as chief of critical care," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an offer from someone who understood that real authority came not from institutional position but from competence that had been tested and proven. 7-figure salary. Full autonomy over hiring, policy, protocol development. "We owe you that much." Laura considered the offer. She considered the fluorescent lights that had been buzzing overhead every shift for 2 years. She considered the antiseptic smell that had become as familiar as her own breathing. She considered the cold steel of the stretchers and monitors and ventilators that had held lives suspended between chaos and recovery. "I'll accept," she said. As she walked through the ICU that night, collecting the few personal items from her old locker, residents stepped aside and nodded with genuine respect. Young people with fresh degrees and civilian worldviews, looking at someone who had proven that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together. One whispered to another, "That's Captain Bennett." In her new office the next morning, Laura hung the shadow box on the wall beside her diplomas. The medals caught the light, the Bronze Star and Silver Star and Purple Hearts that had been wrapped in darkness and erasure and now stood visible as they were meant to be. She pinned the faded unit patch next to it, the Special Forces insignia that had been sewn inside her jacket lining for 2 years, hidden like a secret, now displayed like a truth. On her desk she placed a single photograph, her and the general's son at the rehabilitation ceremony, his hand in hers, both of them smiling. The kind of smile that comes from having walked through fire and found something on the other side worth the burning. She sat down and opened her first case file as Chief of Critical Care. The words came back to her like a meditation, like a prayer, like the only truth that had mattered through all of it. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. If you've made it this far, you know that the healthcare system is only as good as the people willing to stand up when it's failing. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who refuse to stay silent. Like this video if you believe whistleblowers deserve protection. Comment the name of someone in your life who quietly changes everything just by showing up. And remember, the people who've seen the worst are usually the ones who give the most.